From Boers finally returning to middleweight with a big splash, to the Eraser already starting the mind games to mess with the Swedish fighter, here's everything you need to know about Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa. After calling each other out for more than a year, their bout is on for UFC 294. Both of these guys have been going at it for the longest time now. It all started about a year back, when the Brazilian took a swipe at Chimaev, claiming himself to be the reason why the Swede hasn't moved up to middleweight, because he's just too afraid to fight him. And honestly, Costa is a really good fighter. I mean, he packs a lot of power in those nasty punches and kicks. But Khamzat being afraid of him? Now that's something I have a really hard time believing. Just think about it. Boers is one of the most terrifying fighters in the entire promotion. He literally looks like a villain straight out of a James Bond film. And for quite some time, I thought Paulo was just doing it for attention. But it turns out their constant trash talking has finally paid off, as the fans will see these two behemoths clash come UFC 294. It's an announcement that's taken the fight world by storm. And considering how packed the card already is, with some stunning fights on display, this might just end up becoming the biggest event of the year. There were a lot of rumors going around before this that Khamzat was going to stay at welterweight and possibly fight former champion Kamaru Usman, or even get a shot at UFC Gold by taking on Leon Edwards. But it looks like he's about to dance with the big boys now, as he gears up to take on the stunning Paulo Costa for a second ever bout at middleweight. Hold up for a second though, wasn't Costa supposed to fight Ikram Aliskerov? Well, it was actually scheduled for UFC 291, and the fans were pumped to see both of these guys battle it out inside the cage. They were both coming off a fresh victory, and even though Costa's taken on some of the best fighters in the division, this was a highly anticipated fight, because it was going to be a true test of his skills. Ikram was set to star in the fight, coming in hot with 6 consecutive victories under his belt. Believe it or not, the fight was actually on with less than a month left in the event. But out of nowhere, the UFC decided to call things off without even giving fans a reason. But since Dricus du Plessis had to pull out of his bout against Adesanya, it was being predicted that the boss wanted to save Ikram for Izzy, and that's why the fight was called off on such short notice. But after hearing rumors of how Costa would be starring in a huge fight later this year, the fans finally started connecting the dots, before Uncle Dana released a video confirming the Paulo vs. Khamzat bout, leaving the fans absolutely animated and eager to see it all unfold. And while calling off Ikram versus the Eraser does take a lot of credibility away from the 291 event, I think it's all about to be balanced out at UFC 294. Because, just like I said, that card is just jaw-dropping. And don't even get me started about the build-up. Costa is already taking swipes at him. But surprisingly, Khamzat is rather quiet. I'm guessing he's feeling the heat, because it's not going to be the same as taking on welterweights. The only time I saw the Boers uncomfortable inside the cage was against Gilbert Burns. Aside from that fight, the Swedish mixed martial artist pretty much dominated everyone he fought. There was this aura of invincibility around him. And the best part is, it wasn't made up or fake either. He was legitimately a freak of nature in that division, given his undefeated record. And usually, Khamzat is the first one to talk smack. But he's awfully quiet after the UFC 294 announcement. Could it be that the 29-year-old is scared of his second fight at middleweight against Costa? Well, while I still believe Khamzat will put on a solid performance at middleweight, I think it's definitely going to be a little more difficult. For starters, the Eraser is probably the biggest guy he'll ever fight, and taking him down will be much more difficult. If he's thinking of pulling off another Kevin Holland-type matchup, then he needs to think again. So yeah, Chimaev will have to be much more careful and technical against Costa, because he can't get away with all those mistakes he usually makes at welterweight. But interestingly enough, despite facing very little tests in the 185-pound division, the Boers has still opened up the betting odds as the clear favorite going into this fight, proving that the fans are still confident in his abilities. If you ask me, I think it'll be much tougher than it seems, because there's going to be some mental pressure on him now. He's usually just fight everybody, kill everybody. But this time around, he has a beef with the guy he's fighting. Oh, and did you know? Costa and Khamzat have already had an altercation in the past. It happened last year at the UFC Performance Institute, when both of these fighters happened to be present there at the same time. They weren't exactly in a blown-out social media war back then, but the Eraser had been sharing some memes about him. And if I'm being honest, some of them were hilarious, and probably made Chimaev upset. But yeah, Costa was sparring inside the cage when Khamzat and his team happened to walk by. And I'm guessing some words were exchanged or something, but the video shows the Swedish mixed martial artist being held back by his team, while Costa continues to tease him to come sort it out like a man. And that just points back to what I was saying earlier. There's actually some pressure on Khamzat this time around, because usually he's never like this. He's calm and composed, and even in his toughest fight against Burns, don't you remember how he was sitting on top of the octagon cage wall? But seeing him that aggressive and out of control, with a bunch of guys barely able to hold him back, just shows you how personal their beef is. And while that does translate to a mega fight that the fans will love watching, it also means the Boers is more vulnerable, giving Costa an advantage going into this matchup. Cause unlike his opponent, he's having a fun time with it. But yeah, before any more speculation, let's wait to hear what Khamzat has to say about it. I'm expecting a classical comment about how he's gonna butcher Costa inside the cage. Oh, and since we're on the topic, let's hear what bantamweight title contender Sean O'Malley had to say about the fight. Like everyone else, Sugar is losing his mind over how packed the fight card for UFC 294 is. He believes it's going to trend like crazy and possibly be the biggest event of this year. But a lot has to do with the Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa battle. See, unlike most predictions, Sean doesn't really think Costa will have a significant size advantage going into this battle, because Khamzat's been putting on weight for quite some time now. He probably knew that he's done with the welterweight division, and maybe that's why he's been working so hard on his physique. Or, in other words, Sean is basically trying to say that the Boers will be ready, and if the Eraser thinks it's gonna be an easy fight for him, then he seriously needs to sit down and think things through, because it could all turn ugly for him in seconds. O'Malley also commented on how quickly things can change, because just a couple of days before the UFC 284 middleweight bout announcement, Costa was actually going to be fighting someone else. And now he's taking on the legendary Wolf, in a fight that's probably going to make a ton of money. But hey, at least Costa's not losing his cool, right? Fighting Chimaev is a scary experience. And in case you don't believe me, just go and watch his fight against Kevin Holland again. I mean, the way he dominated him in less than a couple of minutes was mind-blowing. But Paulo isn't letting all that get to his head. And instead, he's calling out the Boers, claiming he can never be safe from him now since the fight is booked. The Eraser also talked about how Khamzat had been trying to duck him for the longest time. But since this bout has officially been booked at middleweight, it looks like his days of weight bullying his opponents are over, as he finally faces someone his own size. So, from the Eraser already starting the mind games to mess with the Swedish fighter, to Boers finally returning to middleweight with a big splash, that was everything you needed to know about the thrilling middleweight matchup set for October 2023.